Welcome to another Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition live stream. We'd like to start every stream with a statement of our mission statement and a land acknowledgement of the Anishinaabe. As the longest serving environmental coalition in Michigan's UP, the Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition strives to preserve and enhance the unique cultural and natural resources of the Upper Peninsula through public education, the promotion of sound land stewardship, science-based decisions and policies, and reasoned dialogue with communities, governments, industries, and others with whom we share this land. The Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition recognizes the tribal nations of this territory. We acknowledge that we stand upon the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe. In doing so, we seek to heal traumas inflicted by an ongoing history of colonization and correct intergenerational justice. And we appreciate all of the tribes recognized by the state of Michigan and all the ones that aren't. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for sharing your land. And we hope to be good stewards of it along with you. Well, Horst, would you like to announce tonight's guest? We have a part two from last week, which was a really lively discussion. I will let you take it away, Horst.
Right. Oh, thank you, Evan. Yes, last week we had the original researchers on a solar project in Lance, Michigan, and they discussed their research and found out how it works and how it doesn't work when you're doing community solar versus having some utility do the work. And so today we're going to have another researcher. This is Karl Hoesch, and he's from Michigan State University. And he and two other colleagues, Doug Bissett and Dominic Bednar, wrote a paper this year, or published it at least this year, and wrote about the research they did on the original work done about 6 years ago. And we will also be discussing the legislation for enabling community solar in this state and talk about some of the problems of getting it passed, and also to find out what it's like to do a community solar project. So, Karl, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen now. You guys give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides. Wonderful. All right. So I am so honored to be here, and I wanted to share the paper that I wrote with Doug and with Dominic. And so I wanted to recognize them first. I know that Doug is on the call, so thanks for joining, Doug. And Dominic couldn't be here tonight, but these are my co-authors. Just to make a quick correction, I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm a graduate student there. Doug is at Michigan State, and currently Dominic is out at UC Irvine. So it's definitely a collaboration across universities. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present our research on the energy justice outcomes of the Lance project and to share some perspectives on the community solar enabling legislation that is currently under consideration in the Michigan legislature. Now, in full transparency, neither me nor my co-authors are UPers. Doug and I are trolls, and Dominic is from Baltimore. So as such, I couldn't have completed this work without the help of many individuals on the ground in Lance. And I'd like to acknowledge especially the help of Bob Lefebvre and his team in the village of the Lance Village office, Brett Niemi, who's at WPPI Energy, the staff at Baraga, Houghton, Keweenaw Community Action Agency, Doctors Emily Prahoda, Rochelle Winkler, and Chelsea Shelley for their research, which they presented here last week, which centered the Lance community in the development process. Robert Jackson, Terry Novak, and Lisa Thomas at Eagle, who got me started on this project. And finally, a special thank you to all the residents of Lance and the participants in the community solar project who shared their insights through surveys, interviews, and energy usage. Without them, this definitely would not exist. So thank you to all of you. I wanted to foreground tonight's discussion with a few questions. These are the three questions I hope to answer and that I hope will lead to some more questions from you. The first is, what is energy justice or energy injustice? I'm an energy justice scholar. That's the focus of my dissertation work at Michigan. And so I wanted to center this paper on energy justice, and I think a little bit of a preliminary discussion about energy justice is needed. The next question is the topic of the paper that we wrote. Can a utility-sponsored community solar project in Michigan advance energy justice? And finally, how would community solar enabling legislation change the landscape in Michigan? So bear with me as I go through my notes. First, what is energy justice? It's important to situate energy justice in the context of the overall just transition. So energy justice is equitably distributing energy costs and benefits through a representative and impartial decision-making process. And this infographic illustrates well the relationship between energy justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. And so they are all interrelated. If you've heard of, I think most people have probably heard of environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice are maybe less well known. Climate justice recognizes that some groups are disproportionately affected by climate change, and environmental justice examines environmental issues through the lens of social inequity. So knowing this interrelation, I think, is important. And likewise, the idea of energy justice is often commonly thought of in these three distinct tenets. So there are additional tenets, there are additional frameworks for looking at energy justice, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that energy justice is very contextual. But for this particular paper, we used these three commonly held tenets of energy justice to examine the outcomes of community solar in lots to see if it was meeting what these tenets would be. So first, distributional justice. That's the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of an energy system. For an example that was relevant to this particular study, low-income communities and people of color are more likely to live near polluting sources of energy generation like coal power plants. They're more likely to pay higher prices for electricity and live in less efficient homes than higher income communities and white households. Procedural justice is equitable access to information and authority for decision-making. Energy decision-making is often bureaucratic and techno-scientific, so it limits participation by the public. Without representative governance, decisions are more likely to result in inequitable burdens for some communities. So just as we talked before about how energy justice is interrelated with the other forms of justice, the tenets of energy justice are also interrelated. And finally, recognition justice. Identification of individuals and groups who are vulnerable to energy-related impacts or will become more vulnerable. People of color, Native Americans, low-income households, renters, and seniors are all examples of groups which are more vulnerable to energy impacts. People of color experience longer energy outages, and due to disproportionate health burdens may be more susceptible to outages. So this chart from ACEEE further shows the differences in energy burden. So we talked a little bit about distributional justice. And this is, energy burden is the percentage of a household's income spent on energy expenses. So this looks at that energy burdens across the nation and looks at how those subgroups differ. For example, on the left, you see that the subgroups with that are lower income experience higher energy burdens than the median energy burden, which is the dashed line across the middle. In the kind of orangish color, you see how it's broken down by race and ethnicity. Native Americans, Black households, Hispanic households all experience higher energy burdens than white households. Older adults experience higher than average energy burdens. Renters experience higher energy burdens than homeowners, and low-income multifamily households experience much higher energy burdens than other multifamily units. So these subgroups with higher energy burdens are more likely to face additional barriers also to accessing rooftop solar, which could be a potential aid to their energy burden. These same groups might have lower credit scores. They might not have decision-making power. If they're tenants, they might not be able to decide whether they could put solar on their roof or not. Or they might live in a home with a poor roof or a shaded roof and just not be able to put solar there. So the energy transition offers an opportunity to center justice in the system, to remake this process that has created injustices that we currently live with. And community solar in particular can be a tool for energy justice. Just a few weeks ago, a paper came out which looked at household level data from 11 states and looked at which types of households are participating in community solar. This paper found that community solar adopters in 2023 were 6 times more likely to live in multifamily buildings than rooftop solar adopters, 4 times more likely to be renters, and earned about 23% less annual income than those who had rooftop solar. Now, if you look back at the chart we just looked at, those are these populations that are experiencing higher energy burdens. Those are the same populations that, when they have access to community solar, are subscribing to it, and it's benefiting them. And community solar in particular addresses these Justice 40 priorities, which were outlined by the Biden administration, which in particular wanted to center 40% of the benefits of the energy transition in households that have experienced disproportionate burdens. So they can help with seeing greater household savings, increasing access for low to moderate income households, increasing grid resilience, providing energy democracy, so communities having a say in the process, and even creating more energy jobs. And I wanted to provide a picture. Sometimes it's kind of hard to picture what community solar actually looks like. So it might just be helpful to picture a set of solar panels like this with people's names attached to them. Certain people might have the energy coming from a set of panels, and that's essentially what community solar is. So as of 2023, 23 states plus the District of Columbia have policies that support community solar. Michigan does not. I'll provide some more detail about the distinction between states with and without supporting legislation when we get to question 3. But for now, it's important to note that supporting legislation allows for third parties, like community groups, to own a project, maximizing the financial benefits for owners and subscribers. Without supporting legislation, community solar must be sponsored by an electric utility. This leads to the question, can a utility-sponsored solar project in Michigan advance energy justice? So this project began when, way back in 2019, I was an intern at the Michigan Energy Office and was asked to design a survey to evaluate the Lance Solar project. The Lance project is one of 3 utility-led community solar projects that EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, sponsored using funds from a Department of Energy program called the Clean Energy for Low-Income Communities Accelerator. So that's a mouthful. The acronym is CELICA. So if you hear me say CELICA, that was the funding that EGLE used to help support the Lance project. A goal for each project was to provide renewable energy access to low to moderate income subscribers. To target these subscribers, EGLE and the utilities partnered with community action agencies who administer the National Weatherization Program. So the National Weatherization Program is a program from the Department of Energy, the Federal Department of Energy, that gives money to states, and then community action agencies use that money to do energy efficiency upgrades for low-income households. Things like insulation, replacing furnaces. These CELICA projects used the lists of people who had gone through the weatherization programs to identify households that could benefit from community solar. And EGLE partnered with Lance after the community engagement process that we heard about last week. If you weren't here for the webinar last week, go back and listen to it. So after Lance and the village had gone through this process involving Michigan Tech, going door to door, doing surveys, getting to know if people would be supportive of doing community solar, at that point, EGLE came in and helped to provide additional funding for the project. EGLE provided a grant to pay for the subscriptions of 25 LMI households, low to moderate income households, to receive up to 10 solar panels worth of energy for a period of 25 years. And by funding these subscriptions, EGLE acted as an anchor tenant. So that's an entity that subscribes to a large portion of a solar project and that supports the overall economic feasibility of the project. So usually when a community solar project is getting off the ground, they're looking to be able to subscribe at least a large portion of the project upfront so that they know that they'll be able to make it economically viable. And when the state did that, provided those subscriptions for the low-income households, that helped to support the overall project. And you can see what the Lance array looks like in this picture up in the red box. And if you're not familiar with where Lance is, that's also highlighted on the map. Now, the Lance project is a useful case for 3 reasons. First, it faces some challenges. I mentioned already that it lacks supporting legislation in the state. Now, I'll provide a little bit more detail about that later on, but essentially there isn't as much flexibility in designing the projects in Michigan. Second, there is slightly lower solar irradiation in the UP. It still definitely works to do solar there, but it isn't always as productive as it might be in, say, Arizona. And Lance has actually relatively low electric rates compared to the rest of the UP. The higher the electricity rate, the more the payoff for a solar project. So it's important to look at Lance and its success because, first of all, it faced a number of challenges in getting off the ground. And second, as you can see in this chart, among households that are at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, households in Lance experience higher energy burdens than Michigan and US averages. So this chart has 3 different groups. You see there's the 0 to 100%, that's 0% to 100% of federal poverty level, 100 to 150% of federal poverty level, and 150 to 200%. Lance is in green, and those bars are broken down by electricity expenses, gas expenses, and other. So energy burden is the percentage of someone's income that they have to use to pay for their energy. And Lance is above in each of these categories, the state of Michigan on average and the US as a whole. So a project that is operating in Lance is targeted at a population that could definitely benefit from it. So that's another reason why it's a useful case to look at. And finally, it's a useful case to look at because of everything that we learned about last week, all the steps that led to the preparation of the project, exactly what community solar is intended to be, to involve people in the process for energy democracy. So this study, our study, Doug, Dominic, and I's study, is to look at the outcomes of a project that had done what in theory is the thing that it should be doing. So our methodology involved looking at electricity bill data. So we were able to partner with the Village of Lance and see the energy usage by the households in the low to moderate income program, as well as payment data. So if they had late payments or received bill assistance. We also conducted pre and post surveys. So we did a survey with them over the phone before they started receiving bill credits, and then a survey after they'd had bill credits for over a year. And then we also followed up with some depth interviews with a few participants, as well as some project partners who were involved in the planning of the process. These are our findings, and the findings are separated out by the tenets of energy justice. So the first is distributional justice, which again is the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of our energy system. And I want to point you first to the chart right in the middle, which is the average electricity burden. So this is looking at the average burden for the households, the low to moderate income households who participated in the study. And these households had already been weatherized. They'd already received weatherization benefits from the BHK Community Action Agency. So their electricity burden had actually decreased a little bit already before receiving the solar credits. But you can see the clear decline in their overall energy burden after receiving the solar credits. And then there was a few things that we were able to identify in terms of their interaction with the utility. So overall, the participants who had to receive bill assistance to help with paying their bills decreased from the year before to the year after from 45% to 15%. So 45% needed bill assistance before getting the credits, 15% after. Also significant was the number of months where they had late or partial payments. And that decreased from an average of 5.86 months to 4.27 months per subscriber. And you might think that reducing late payments is only benefiting the village utility. But in terms of conversations and even on the survey, the response from the participants of the decreased stress they had in terms of having fewer late payments, the ability to not juggle so many bills. We also asked about mental health in this study, and that was a significant factor. So decreasing late payments was a big part of lowering their overall burden, not just in terms of the burden that the village might have in terms of following up with getting payment, but the stress of managing a household. And the average savings for the participants was about $300 per year. And that varied a little bit just depending on the solar irradiation on the panels. You know, a cloud might be over one more than another. So it varied a little bit from 280 to about 320. So next we evaluated procedural justice. And again, procedural justice is about people's involvement in the process, whether or not they have a say and are able to influence decisions. And the first thing that really influenced the outcomes of procedural justice in the Lance project was that they had an exemplary community engaged project to inform its design. The research that was presented last week highlighted some of this, but they had these cafe events where people were able to speak about what they thought. Then they designed surveys based off of the participants' perspectives. The surveys went out to the whole community, and then they took that survey data and then they came back and did another discussion where they asked people what they wanted. And one of the things that came out of that discussion is they wanted low-income participants to be able to participate in the project, and they didn't want bills to go up for people who didn't participate. So those were two things that ended up being a part of the design of this project. So that engagement process really worked.
The black flies are awful.
So another aspect of that I think is important, though, in terms of the engagement is even though that engagement was exemplary and rare and something that doesn't happen in a lot of projects, when I spoke to LMI participants, many of them said, I couldn't go to those engagement sessions. I didn't have a car. I worked third shift and second shift. There was a number of factors. So even at the best level of engagement, there are still barriers, and there's room for improvement and figuring out creative ways to include more participants from different income levels. The second big finding in terms of procedural justice was access to information. So community solar is kind of a complicated idea. A lot of people, when they hear about solar, are thinking about solar on the roof. Even after they've kind of gone through the process, it still seems like, okay, how are these electrons going to get to my house? So it also, in terms of understanding the program, there's aspects of trust. So when you get a letter in the mail that says, oh, you can sign up to get extra money off of your bill, it can be a little bit confusing, and you may have a different type of trust relationship with your utility. So something that worked really well in the case of the village of Lance is that a lot of individuals in the village pay their utility bills in person. And even though they got a letter in the mail inviting them to participate in this project, they discarded it. They didn't look at it. Not everybody opens their utility bill all the time. But these people, when they go in to pay their bill, would have conversations with the village staff. And being a small community, the village staff often knew them. They knew that they were people who could benefit from this project. They were able to explain it to them. And that knowledge transfer was a really important aspect that was key to the success of this program. Another big finding in terms of procedural justice was program salience. And by that, we mean like how noticeable is the savings that they are experiencing, and how noticeable is the project itself? Are people actually seeing this solar? The idea behind that is you could just get a bill credit on your bill that's an assistance to help with the cost of whatever expenses you might have in terms of energy. However, there is something more to having access to solar. There's something more to having your energy come from renewable energy that can help to inform how you save energy, and can also help to inform how you budget if you notice it on your bill. And so we asked participants about how much they noticed about the savings from the project. And there were some that noticed it a lot. There were some that didn't. And that just kind of depended on how informed they were. But that was another key finding, that continually showing people where their energy is coming from and how they are saving would help to inform some of their behaviors. At the same time, people who were able to see the solar panels, who'd gone and visited them, shared a sense of pride, and that's what we call the warm glow feeling. That's this idea that their community was producing its own energy, that their community was doing something that a lot of other communities weren't doing, and having access to that was another benefit of the project itself. Our final area of findings relates to recognition justice, and recognition justice is all about the fact that there are some communities who are more vulnerable to energy impacts, or who might become more vulnerable as we transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So 3 big questions arose as we focused on recognition justice. First, was this program targeted to the neediest cases? Were these the people who really needed it, or was it people who were just the easiest to sign up? And the fact that this program was targeted to people who'd gone through weatherization assistance ensured that those people had incomes that were at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. At least they were when they were weatherized. Now, some of these people had been weatherized years prior, so it's possible that their income had gone up. But as I mentioned before, the fact that utility staff knew these people in person and were able to communicate with them and known their bill history, it's likely that they were able to target this to people who could benefit the most. That being said, all of the people who were invited to participate had participated in home weatherization, and that program primarily caters to homeowners. So of the 25 LMI participants in the program, all 25 were homeowners. And as I showed before, in terms of the overall energy burden and barriers to access for rooftop solar, renters are one of the primary groups that tends to have a higher energy burden and has more difficulty getting rooftop solar. So that was one area where this program could have been improved in terms of targeting renters. And then finally, are non-subscribers paying more? That would be the idea of making some people more vulnerable through this process. And the way it was designed, and Village Manager Bob Lefebvre did a great job of this, working with Brett Neame and also making sure that they worked with getting different funding sources. They made sure that when this project was designed, it didn't increase rates for other non-subscribing households. So overall, the findings from the study, we found a lot of strengths and positive energy just outcomes from the Village of Lance model. But at the end of the day, the question is, okay, Lance was a very special place. I mean, it's a beautiful place in and of itself. It's in the UP, it's on the water. It has someone in the village manager in Bob Lefebvre who is a policy champion, who is excited about energy and is advocating for his community. And it has a close-knit community. Are the experiences in Lance replicable to other places? And I would say that if you had asked us that question a couple of years ago, we might have said, maybe, but it would be really difficult. But a few things have come on in the last 2 or 3 years, which really help to promote projects like Lance. The first is this thing you'll see on the left of your screen, the National Community Solar Partnership. It's an online network of experts and government policymakers who help to provide local communities with technical assistance, with information. They essentially can help to support to do some of the things that Michigan Tech was able to help with in terms of technical feasibility for the solar project, even before they did the community engagement, suggestions for how to do community engagement, and access to grants to do that sort of thing. And then on the right, you see an announcement about Solar for All. And this just came out a few months ago, that under the Solar for All program, which is part of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, it's part of the Inflation Reduction Act, states across the US are receiving over in Michigan's case, over $150 million to help support community solar programs. So while Lance depended on that funding from EGLE for economic viability, there are other funding sources to help to replicate similar types of projects like the Lance project. So those could be done today. So our conclusion is the Lance case is one that should be a great model. It is a municipal utility project that promoted energy just outcomes. And there are now resources that can help, maybe not exactly the same way. One thing that's important to note about community solar is that it's different wherever you are. It's very location specific, but we are encouraged to see that there are ways that these energy just outcomes could be replicated in other locations. With that, I want to turn now to the idea of community solar legislation. And in particular, the question of how would community solar supporting legislation change the landscape in Michigan? And I just spent 30 minutes explaining how the Lance Community Solar Project resulted in energy just outcomes. And that was the conclusion of our paper, and I believe that. At the same time, this conversation right now, I want to emphasize that as good as all those things are, it's my opinion that community solar supporting legislation could make replicating the Lance project or making other types of projects that could promote solar energy justice even more feasible. And these two maps, I think, provide a good picture of the potential effect of community solar enabling legislation. So the first map is the map on the right. The map on the right shows the states that have already enacted community solar enabling or supporting legislation. And as of 2023, the end of 2023, there were 23 states plus the District of Columbia. Alaska is waiting for the governor to sign their legislation, so soon to be 24 states. The map on the left shows what the National Renewable Energy Lab has labeled as community solar projects throughout the US, and shows where all those projects are, and the size of the circle corresponds to the capacity or the size of the project. So the smaller the dot, the smaller the project, the bigger the circle, the bigger the project. So I want to point out a few things about these two maps that I think is really helpful. So first, notice in the map on the left, the one with the circles and the dots, that Florida, Texas, and kind of the Arkansas-Mississippi border have some really large circles. Those are huge projects, over 200, between 75 to 200 megawatt projects. These are utility-owned projects. If you look back over now on the map on the right, you'll see that that whole area in the south does not have enabling legislation. So those are projects that are only built if a utility wants to build them and support them. In Florida, for example, most of the projects are about 74.5 megawatts because that size cap helps them to have a certain amount of siting leeway. And they're owned and operated by Florida Power and Light, and almost anyone in the state can subscribe to the energy from those projects. So the community in that sense is the whole state of Florida, and you might not be anywhere near where those projects are, but you have access to subscribe to them. Now I want to contrast this with Minnesota and New York. And if you look at those states on the map on the left, you see a ton of little tiny dots. They have many, many more projects than Florida and Texas, but each project has a smaller capacity. So if you just look at overall capacity, Minnesota, New York, Florida, and Texas are right at the top. They're pretty comparable in terms of overall capacity. But if you look at the number of projects in each state, Minnesota and New York have way more projects than Texas and Florida. So in Minnesota and New York, there is enabling legislation which allows third-party organizations to own their own projects. That means private developers who are not utilities can come in and develop a project, and different types of communities can subscribe to the energy from those projects. And then the regulated utility in the state would buy the energy from those projects, and people would get credits on their bills. So with enabling legislation, you can see many more and smaller projects, and those can come about in different ways. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about community solar legislation, where it comes from, and what the bills are that are before us now in the state of Michigan. So one thing that's really interesting about community solar legislation that's a little bit rare when talking about renewable energy is that community solar legislation enjoys bipartisan support. So in Michigan, the legislation is co-sponsored by Senator Ed McBroom and Senator Jeff Irwin. So a Democrat and a Republican from the Upper Peninsula, Democrat from Ann Arbor, got together because they both see benefit in community solar. It also shares bipartisan support nationally. I just mentioned that in Alaska just a few weeks ago, community solar legislation passed. They have Republican control of the governorship and the state house and the Senate. They passed community solar legislation, and it's just awaiting the governor's signature. So this isn't necessarily a partisan issue. The legislation that has been proposed, and I just focused on the Senate bills, not the House bills, but the Senate bills that have been proposed also have some key features that I think are worth highlighting that would show like what the strengths of this project could be. So Senate Bill 152 and Senate Bill 153, these are tie-barred, so they have to go together. And essentially what these bills do is they require the Public Service Commission to establish certain rules and rates that would go with community solar subscriptions. So if you had a community solar subscription, the Public Service Commission would determine what the rate would be that you'd get paid back for that. They would then also, Senate Bill 153 requires electric providers to put credits on people's bill who own subscriptions. So say you lived in my hometown of, or let's say you lived in Flint, and you and a bunch of community members got together and were able to develop a project. You subscribed to 10 panels worth of solar. Consumers Energy serves the Flint area, so they would buy the power from that facility and credit it to your electric bill. So every month you would see a credit on your bill for however much in the project you owned. Now I want to highlight a couple things on these two bills that I think are really worth noting, and I think also address a lot of the criticism that comes sometimes for community solar. These things are lessons that have been learned over the last 10 years of national community solar legislation. Minnesota was an early adopter of community solar legislation 10 years ago, and they have recently updated their bills to accommodate for the things that I have highlighted in yellow here. First of all, they saw a ton of growth. You saw all those dots in the state of Minnesota. But when they looked back over 10 years, they saw that a lot of commercial entities had subscribed to the majority of the output from their community solar facilities. So one thing that they did is they updated their legislation is that they put in rules that nobody would hold more than a 40% share of output. So that's something that comes directly from that legislation. This idea that that subscriptions should be relatively small, so at least 60% of capacity subscriptions are for 40 kilowatts or less, helps to ensure that more of these subscriptions are going to residents rather than to larger businesses. And another thing that was a lesson learned from the Minnesota case was that they wanted to ensure that these were being targeted to low-income subscribers or low-income service organizations. So the legislation guarantees that at least 30% of each project's or overall capacity in community solar is reserved for those particular communities. So I think that these bills show a lot of promise. They've taken some of the best nuggets of information from some of the other legislation that's out there, and they have potential to increase the number of community solar projects that could be in the state of Michigan. Just to kind of go back at our map, if you look at the state of Michigan, National Renewable Energy Lab finds that we have about 10 projects in the state of Michigan. You look at how few there are relative to the states around us. With enabling legislation, that could change. So those are a couple of things to note about enabling legislation. Getting close to wrapping up, and I'm excited to answer any questions. Lastly, I just wanted to share a couple of community solar efforts that are happening in Michigan. The first is a group of researchers and community leaders in the Flint area are doing something very similar to what Michigan Tech did in Lantz to engage the community with conversations of what they might want in terms of community solar. So holding community meetings at senior centers, at parks, at churches, to ask people, where would you want to see community solar if you could? What kind of program would you want to design? What would it look like? Now, Flint is in the consumers energy territory. So really community solar would only be possible there if this enabling legislation is passed. But this group is looking at research, and I'm actually a part of the steering committee for this group to see what would the community like to be ready if that legislation would pass. Another project worth highlighting is that in Detroit, they're working on this project that's called Solar Neighborhoods. And there's a key distinction here that this isn't community solar. Detroit is using vacant land to build out solar projects that will power their municipal buildings. So it won't be owned by a number of different entities. All the power will be going to Detroit, but they're placing these smaller scale projects in vacant land. And that way it's very similar to the size and scale of other community solar projects. And some of the community members around those facilities will benefit with energy efficiency upgrades. And so that is a type of workaround that you can spread energy benefits even when enabling legislation isn't possible. But should enabling legislation pass, these type of projects could even provide access to energy credits in a stronger way for some of those communities that are hosting projects in Detroit. I've been talking at you for a long time. I appreciate everybody who's been following along. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you so much, Karl. That was such a great and comprehensive coverage of all that. We have one question here from Connie saying, how many milliwatts is the Lance community solar?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Lance project is very small. So I have to look at my notes, but I think it's about 300 kilowatts. So it's not even a megawatt in size. In fact, that picture that you saw on that map that I had earlier is just like one strip of panels. And that's one of the beautiful things about community solar too, is that it can really be adaptable to different sizes.
Well, I've got a question for you. So, we have one more from Kai. Here's a follow-up here. How many people are on the community solar in Lance?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact number. There's the 25 low to moderate income households represent, I think, about 60% of the capacity. And then there are some church groups. There's like a church or two, and then I think about another 20 households. So I think it's close to 50 entities in total.
Okay. It's a good test group. What I'm curious about is I'm wondering if we could address some of the opposition just head on, because I was looking into this a little bit and I was seeing that community solar is already costing energy consumers in Michigan around $10 million a year. Not because of any community solar projects, not because of the government, but that's what the big energy companies are spending to try to oppose it. So they're taking those costs of energy and, spending that money to try to stop community solar projects. And what they're saying is it's going to be really expensive for taxpayers who aren't even benefiting from it. So if there was enabling legislation, how much would people's taxes actually go up? How much would this actually affect people?
Well, people's taxes wouldn't go up. Their rates might, if the utilities are using a lot of the money to fight it. In terms of like their rates just from the utilities buying community scale solar as opposed to developing their own solar, it's really hard to compare. But I think that argument that rates are going to go up just because of community solar is I think it's not necessarily like an apples and oranges or an apples to apples type of argument, because this solar is with rooftop solar, you're already seeing some types of cross subsidization. By having community scale solar, you're going to have more people that have access to it, and so there already is some shifting that happens there. But also with different private developers coming in to do these types of projects, there's some level of competition that bids down some of these prices. Now, they're having to buy energy at smaller scale than they would have to if they built a large utility scale solar. But that means that some of those profits that would be going to the utility will instead be going to communities. So I think that they're not necessarily wrong that it's possible that some prices would go up, but at the same time, a lot of prices could also go down.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it from the aspect of, so if there's this legislation that is subsidizing things, like how much do we actually need to subsidize for these communities, and like who would eventually be paying for that? Like do we have a fair way of doing this?
Do we have a fair way of, you mean like replicating the subsidies that like came from the Eagle project to subsidize for low income households? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, that's the Solar for All funding that was announced about a month ago. A lot of that is going to support the like access for low income households. So there is already funding for that. At the same time, right now, if you are wanting to buy into a community solar project, like maybe you were going to subscribe to a consumer's community solar project, a lot of the consumers has built in some profits based on their rate structure with the state of Michigan, with the Michigan Public Service Commission. If you are doing it through a third party entity, some of those profits are the economic viability of those profits allows for other savings. So it is economically possible that like you would save money whether you're a low income subscriber or not, and the subsidy that's coming from other entities like Solar for All funding can provide access to people who otherwise wouldn't. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I wonder what you were saying earlier about, some rates potentially going down. Like if we had more energy competition, if people had more choices in different areas about how they could get their energy, and people in, different circumstances, could get it in different ways that would make sense for them. Maybe there would be, room for increased efficiencies because of that competition would create a drive to try to make energy in general. Maybe, some of the bigger energy companies would have to come up with a solar option too.
I think also it's worth pointing out. So the argument that prices would go up, it also is kind of simplifying the economics of the overall situation, because community solar is allowing for distributed energy. It can have some resilience benefits. So instead of having one solar plant that's connected to transmission grid and it's a really big plant, and if that goes down, having a lot more scattered smaller projects can help to help make the grid a little bit more healthy. It's closer to the source, so you're not seeing as much loss on the distribution lines as well. Just there also, I think, are benefits that are a little bit harder to quantify of being able to say, yes, I want my energy here. I want to have access to renewable energy and having a say in that process. So, and I also saw that somebody had chimed in too with the accurate capacity for the Lance project being 110 kilowatts. Thank you, Catherine, for chiming in.
And Catherine had done another comment here. Michigan received today 129 million in federal grants to accelerate clean energy projects. This constitutes debt financing.
That was I think the EPA grant that was announced today. Is that right, Catherine? Yeah, so I do think there's quite a bit of funding, that would be available to make more projects like Lance possible. And I saw kind of you asked if Lance wants to build a bigger community solar project now. They so it's been a little while since I've asked this question of Bob Lefebvre, the village manager. They certainly have not ruled it out, and I think that they have space where they could build it, because it's in the industrial park in Lance, which was also one of the reasons why the project was so successful. They shared this last week. I don't think they have any immediate plans to expand it, but I think that they certainly could.
Karl, I was impressed by your work and that of the previous researchers on how much time and energy had to be put in to make it work. So the real issue isn't the technology. The real issue is people being involved and getting the ability to see that there's a benefit to them, and basically kind of reinforcing, based on what you heard from the utility people at Lance. So, and I'm thinking that there's another group that's trying to work in another county in the UP, and they have nowhere near the scale of what the Lance project did, and it's almost impossible without inside connections to move forward. And I think this whole thing of trust is the really huge thing, because if you or I go into those communities, I'm an outsider, you're an outsider, you're an even outsider than I am, and so the question is, how can one find individuals who are willing to put time and energy into making a project work? What incentive we need to offer individuals who have that kind of commitment?
That is a great question. And yeah, it brings to light a comment that Bob Lefebvre made while I was interviewing him, that he said he'd been the village manager for 13 years. and he could spend the rest of his life in Lance and be buried in the cemetery there, and they'd still consider him an outsider because, you know, there's that legacy of that connection, which is also a beautiful thing. I think, and I'm going to borrow this idea from some of what the utility scale developers are trying to do. They are, in a lot of instances, utility scale developers, so people who are building bigger projects. And I want to go on the record as saying too, I think that there is a role for all the different scales of solar energy. Utility scale is needed, community scale is needed, rooftop solar is needed. There's barriers to utility scale solar as well. And what they're doing in a lot of cases is working on developing campaigns in the same way you would have a political campaign, where you would have people who are trained on the ground to get to know neighbors, to communicate, and to really try to do a grassroots type movement. I think that might be getting at kind of what you're getting at, Horst, with developing some of that trust on the ground. But it also brings to mind, I think, something that I would, respond to Evan's earlier question too about cost. Another project that actually Doug and I are also working on with another research team is looking at people who live near large scale solar facilities and some of the opposition that we might see with some of those projects. There are increasingly increasing resistance to large scale projects in different communities throughout the US. And so there's a lot of research that's been going into understanding why that is. And some of the indication is that the larger the projects are, the more people expect to be involved, and the more likely there is to be a fight over some of that siting. So while it may be an argument that community solar might be more costly because it's smaller scale and you lose some of the economies of scale, you may actually find savings in terms of community acceptance, in terms of how fast you could build a project if it's a smaller project, because smaller projects aren't as visually obtrusive to some people, and you could build more smaller projects than maybe one larger project.
Well, you know, one of the things that we haven't really touched upon is how do we let's see, what was I going to say? How do we make it work in large cities, for example? Because one of the big problems you have is utilities like to hold on to that money, and as was mentioned in the article that I put on the screen before, the utilities also want some of that money. They're willing to charge you an extra $3 if you let them to get clean energy, theoretically. But we don't really know where it is because there's no accountability on their part. And so when I'm looking at, say, a large cities around the country, you need some kind of organization outside of any government body in order to be able to work with people in the same way that you do in a small town like Lance. I mean, it's still the same thing. How do you do that? And then the question is, where does the money come from? Because Catherine pointed out in her comment that you're creating debt when you provide subsidies, but that's part of what you were talking about, which is redistributing taxes to those who are less fortunate. So that raises all kinds of issues.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that kind of stuck out to me as in your question. One is, I think, the role of, in larger cities and in other areas, like where do you get these trusted entities to help with running these programs, with recruiting people, with kind of managing some of these things. And I think maybe another thing that was pretty interesting about the Lance projects, and actually all the Celica projects in Michigan that the State Energy Office did, was working with community action agencies that are already on the ground, already trusted, already working with the populations they want to target. So there are some resources already there. Other people have suggested working with, in rural areas, working with university extension offices that have that level of trust. So working with some institutions that are already there. In terms of that financing, and the arguments of whether this is we're subsidizing some populations over others, there's debt, there are that there's going to be probably a politically hot button issue there. At the same time, there are certainly arguments for how that tax money is being spent that we aren't always quantifying well what the benefits of these projects are. The benefits of a solar project that takes a coal project offline, reducing the air pollution that's going to impact health impacts for low-income populations, and then helping to reduce the energy burden, which is going to provide more health benefits because of increased thermal comfort, reduced expenses, so better nutrition, more money to spend on groceries, which is what a lot of our participants said, how they were spending their money. These things are investments. So rather than looking at it as a subsidy for people or a handout, it's actually maybe a long-term investment. And by funding it in community solar, rather than what we're already doing right now, is we have LIHEAP dollars, which are just short-term energy subsidies. These are actually sustainable subsidies that are going to connect people to renewable energy that's going to keep on producing and reduce their overall bill. So it might initially seem like, oh yeah, this is going to be just moving one pot of money over to another and not necessarily helping in the long term. But I think by investing in these types of projects and then connecting them with the populations that really need them, we're helping to create lasting change.
Well, subsidies are always going to be an issue, whether it's for utility water or for sewer, and that all of those are considered costs. And I guess what we're really saying is there needs to be a mindset change in terms of how we view costs versus them being benefits. And again, there's just not going to be any way to please anyone with that. But I did want to mention something else that has come up recently, which are data centers, hydrogen, and cryptocurrency usage of internet services, and their huge draw on power. And I'm hearing that right now we can put all the solar online that we want. We still have to keep the fossil fuel plants operating if we decide to put those in. So the question really is, do we need to have some type of a prioritization, probably legislative, to deal with the issue of who gets energy and who doesn't? And for example, with a data center, do we really want to invite them in and have our state government give them a subsidy to get the money for local taxes? So it's like I know, it's just kind of weird. This is my response is how can we prioritize some of these things and keep the temperature down under 1.5 centigrade.
That is a really great question, and I feel like it's just starting to be asked by the people who really need to ask that question, because we already looking at the energy transition. It's a steep hill to climb, and it has to happen fast just to meet the energy demand of what we already had. And because of some resiliency issues, people always point out the sun doesn't always shine. It's not always windy. You need to overbuild renewable energy to make sure that you are meeting even the demand that isn't associated with AI centers and cryptocurrency and data mining. And so I think it's an interesting idea of prioritizing energy. I think there's a couple of interesting studies, one out of the UK from back in, I think, 2016, that looked at what is the minimum amount of energy that we should guarantee, almost like a basic income amount of energy. Because when we say we're prioritizing energy, then you have to make that's energy justice. How do you make a value statement about what is essential? And so they would bring this study in particular, brought in people to do all these different forums of okay, what do you actually need energy for? Should people be expected to be able to operate a computer and a TV, and at what point does somebody's basic energy needs get met, and how then can we quantify that relative to whatever is happening with crypto or with AI. And I think that's a really big challenge. And I don't know that there's an appetite politically to digest that. So I'm not sure what the solution is at this point, other than we need to build a lot of renewable energy, and at the same time, there's tough questions with that.
But I mean, the question is, how fast can we build out, and then what's going to come after the data centers? So we don't know, but it reminds me of what I've read about in Great Britain, where they had the gas meters in the house, and you would actually be able to put coins in if you wanted to pay for more heat. So rationing may be in our future, which is really ironic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And rationing would, again, like that, the most vulnerable populations would be the ones who would be most at risk. So yeah.
Well, I see your
I'm not the guest here, Horst, but I want to give my take on this too, just to, contribute to the conversation here a little bit, especially with the data centers. Um, One thing is that we really need to move on to some newer technologies. I mean, like, solar and electrification is a big part of that. But also right now, we have quantum computers that are operable, and we are developing in that direction. And right now, quantum computers have about a 99.95% energy reduction versus classical computers. So it's a huge change. Once we can sunset the current kind of technology, which is extremely energy hungry, we can move on to some other things. But in order to do that, we need a lot of research and development. We need to be able to educate people. We need people to be able to put themselves in positions where they can take on those types of, engineering jobs and things like that. And to get there, we have to give, people the tools that they need to be able to thrive. And when we have so many people that are in, underserved communities that don't have access to resources, that don't have time to get an education, we're leaving behind a lot of potential help with all the work that needs to be done to develop these solutions. And so I think just getting people to the point where they can be self-sufficient and where they can contribute how they want to and how they're able to is probably the best thing we can possibly do for reducing energy.
Yeah, I had no idea about quantum computers. Thank you so much for sharing that, Evan.
Well, I guess our golden age will arrive when fusion energy is abundantly quantum computers are out there for us, ready to do the service at a fraction of the energy that's needed now. But unless there are other questions or comments, I want to really thank you, Karl, for taking the time and energy that you needed in order to present to us. And I just want to remind people that if you haven't already, contact Ed McBroom and let him know that you support those two energy bills. I put the information on the bills themselves in the chat, and also an article about how the utilities are very unhappy with the idea of having community solar. And I guess the main thing is we're trying to replace a 100-year-old legal structure that really doesn't suit us anymore. It's kind of like forcing us into a straitjacket so that they benefit and we get thinner. So that's basically what I see as our big challenge at this time. So make sure you contact your state representative in your areas, and then Senator McBroom, and let him know that you really want community solar to be available in a way that does not create more problems. So, and
Well
so
said.
all I have. So I thank you again, Karl, and Evan. I thank you again for hosting our program today. It makes life a lot easier for me, and I appreciate that too. So thank you everyone else for coming tonight, and we will be posting the program on Facebook and YouTube, Evan.
Yes, that's right. We are live streaming to our YouTube channel, and we have that linked in a Facebook event, and we got a post on there. So whether you're following us on Facebook or whether you have access to YouTube, please tell your friends, link to us. If you have any interest in information, just reach out to upec@upenvironment.org, and we'd be happy to share any kind of resources we have with you.
Right, and upcoming events, we're going to have Roger Blanchard from the Lake Superior State University in the Sioux talk about the oil that's in the ground and in the U.S. and it's going to be an interesting program. We had him on before, and he's kind of like a breath of fresh air when it comes to how much oil we have left and what our options are. So that's that. And then the other one, we plan to have a talk on the legislation that was passed that has an environmental bend to it. And so you have an idea of what our legislature has been doing in that area. So those are the two upcoming things that I'm aware of that we're going to have. And we're always looking for other topics. So if you're interested in something, let us know. We'll see if we can find someone who can talk to the topic that you suggest. So good night, everyone, and thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Have a good night.
Thank you.